And now, for the last but not least presentation of the day, the Secretary General of COSATU, Congress of South African Trade Unions, Zwelinzima, Vavi, will address us and remind us about the conditions of employment during the apartheid period. And I dare say, Mhlegas, you might refer to the question of BDS as touched on by the previous speaker. Thanks very much, Siyabonga Kankulu. Kuluma, Chief.
Thank you very much, Chairperson, and everybody present here. Thank you very much for the opportunity. As with all the other aspects of South African life, political, socio-economic, the life of a worker and the working class in apartheid South Africa was determined by the workers' race. Workers were privileged or disadvantaged depending on the racial classification they were given by the state. While the entire working class was exploited by white capital, black workers were discriminated against, while white workers were a labor aristocracy with a range of rights that were denied to their black counterparts. And amongst black people, African workers were more disadvantaged than colored workers, and who were more disadvantaged than the Indian workers. It must be remembered that the exploitation of black workers in South Africa depended not only on the exploitation of the individual black worker, but also on the entire black working class. Thus, discrimination and disadvantage permeated the black working class as a whole. There was a litany of apartheid laws that were put in place in order to target black workers in its entirety, in order to keep it subservient, exploited, and subjugated. These laws did not apply directly to the white working class. Palestinian workers and the Palestinian working class are, as black workers and the black working class in South Africa, were oppressed and exploited simply because of their racial and ethnic background. As apartheid South Africa attempted to do with the black working class, apartheid Israel too seeks to humiliate and degrade the Palestinian working class, robbing it of its dignity and attempting to beat it into submission to cruel, racist system. Palestinian workers and the Palestinian working class face under the Zionist Israel. First, that while South African apartheid state and the white capital remained till the very end entirely dependent.
Sorry, I think your mic's off.
Yeah, not my fault. I can use my software voice. Can't come to the table, but a little bit louder from where I am. Let me repeat the point that I was making, that while the South African apartheid state and white capital remained till the very end entirely dependent on the black labor, the Israel state and Israel capitalism have divested themselves of this dependency. Second, and following from the first, is that in apartheid South Africa, the state attempted to keep the black people in their place. And they could be pliant workers that were easy to exploit. The apartheid Israel wishes to ethnically cleanse the Palestinian working class and the Palestinian people more generally. Allow me to be more specific about the ways in which the black workers were oppressed and exploited in South Africa on the basis of their race. As mentioned, the conditions for black workers were highly discriminatory, disadvantageous, and degrading. The apartheid government ensured through the institutionalization of racism and with the active complicity of white capitalists, the black workers were allowed only certain types of labor-intensive jobs and or low-level clerical positions, paid a menial wage and not allowed to be promoted to higher positions which were reserved for whites. And this was not just being done voluntarily. This was part and parcel of the stringent laws that were passed in the apartheid parliament where the black people were not represented. We can highlight 5 elements of the apartheid workplace that made its experience unique. The racial division of labor, the racial segregation of facilities, the racial structure of power, the migrant labor system, the pass laws, the color bar, the Group Areas Act, and the Bantu education system. Understanding these elements of labor segregation is important to understand the role and impact apartheid had on the working class and the black South Africans in the workplace. The racial division and labor meant black workers were restricted to menial jobs and were assistants to white artisans, even when the former were more skilled. You still have to be an assistant. And there were all manner of names given to black people who were doing this type of jobs. I remember in the mines, they were using the name called Pikinini. The Pikinini means the small one in some language that was constructed in the mines as some form of a medium of communication in order to give a meaning that was in itself demeaning. Pikinini means small. No matter how old was the worker, as long as he was a black worker, an African worker in particular, he will still be referred to as a Pikinini. And he must, in return, call the white worker with no skills whatsoever the clean pass. The clean pass was an apartheid term that was referring to the white people in general as this pass, which I really never understood what it meant in totality. Pass, because pass is a pass. And I suspect that this pass was meaning just big. Now, the clean pass means the small, big pass, whatever that means in that mentality. White workers monopolized more skills operating and artisan jobs and the mid-level and senior managerial positions. This gave birth to a grading system based on color and ethnic lines, where workers were paid and positioned within the work environment according to their skin color. Dr. Busak in his presentation here spoke about this happening over a generation of times. And earlier today, and that's why my voice is a little bit injured, I was in a rally speaking about how that reconstruction of a society remained a reality of South Africa until today. That on average, for example, this day, white workers still earn 19,000 rands against black workers, Africans in particular, who on average are earning 2,700 rands. That's now 17 years into democracy. But the construction of the system happening from 1652, intensified by the 1948 coming into the National Party into government, have meant that until today, yes, we don't have the apartheid legislation anymore, but the living reality of ordinary people is that that construction over so many decades is just their living reality at this moment. By the way, Chairperson, today I had the bad luck of being in the same plane with the former Minister of Police, who I don't know what is he coming to do in Cape Town, Adrian Flock. Adrian Flock was in a plane with me today. He doesn't know that I don't remember how many times I was detained as a young child under his emergency regulations. And I felt that I would not take the opportunity to remind him of the atrocities that he committed against our people. Now, I have lots of things to say about the specific legislations that were passed under apartheid, but in the interest of time, let me just talk about one of those, the Group Areas Act, which helped to regulate the lives of black workers and the black working class more generally. This legislation assigned different racial groups to different residential and business areas. And I'm sure at the point of opening this tribunal here, in this historic venue in the history of our country, you would have spoken about what that piece of legislation did to family life of the people that were wearing a wrong color residing in this area, were forcefully removed out of this area because their color was wrong and they were far too close to town. The purpose of that Group Areas Act was always to exclude blacks from living in the most developed areas, such as this one, which were reserved for whites only. It has serious and profound implications for black workers, causing them to travel long distances from their homes in order to reach their places of work. Blacks were regularly forcefully removed for living in the wrong areas. The Group Areas Act, together with the various acts that established the Bantu stands and forced the Africans to be citizens of those Bantu stands, they were called homelands, ensured that whites owned 87% of the land in South Africa and black people only owned 13%. The comparison with the Palestinian Bantu stands, which are defined by the Israeli settlement infrastructure and Israeli military control, is not misplaced on that question at all. Of course, in the Palestinian case, there is more insidious objective of forcing the indigenous people to leave the land completely, as we have already heard, thus cleansing it of their presence. One of the most important instruments of apartheid that had a deep long-term objectives and the effects was the Bantu Education Act of 1953, which was the foundation of the apartheid system itself. It aimed to keep black South Africans uneducated, even though educated. Its major provision was the enforced separation of races in all education institutions. The policy of Bantu education was aimed at directing black, particularly African, used to be unskilled labor or into the unskilled labor market, and to provide a large pool of laborers at low cost to the South African capitalist. Many of you will remember the quote of the apartheid, or one of the apartheid architects, Hendrik Verwoerd, the statement that he made at the time when this piece of law was enacted. I'm not going to repeat that here because of the time. In essence, blacks and whites under apartheid lived separately and unequally. Black children grew up in terrifying conditions in townships where tarred roads, electricity were a privilege, where a pit latrine was a normality, and only had the most dilapidated and resource-strapped schools to attend and hospitals to go to. The separate and unequal development is demonstrated by a simple fact that my late father and mother and my other 11 siblings do not know their exact dates of birth this moment. I also do not know exactly when I was born myself. At my baptism, the priest just took a look at me and took a wild guess, 20th of December, 1962. And that stuck with me until today. To this day, my family does not celebrate any birthdays because we never knew when we were born.
Sorry,
This experience...
Could you just complete in a minute?
Okay.
Thank you.
This experience is one that is shared by many, many black South Africans. Meanwhile, the white counterparts enjoyed everything that I won't speak about now because of time. Let me repeat by saying this, that the precious gift of childhood innocence was robbed from us as black children growing up in the Bantu stands where I also grew up, and various townships across the country. By the late 1980s, military vehicles and soldiers armed with heavy artillery had become an integral picture of the township life. Under the state of emergency, gunshots and police invasions into our homes substituted the lullaby. The loss of the innocence and childhood pleasures by black children in South Africa is a similar experience of the Palestinian children today, growing up under occupation with consistent sight of military vehicles and heavy weapons. The ears of the Palestinian children have become accustomed to sound of bombs and grenades from the Israeli army. Clearly, apartheid was a well-planned and oiled machine of racial segregation. And tell me what is the difference between what we have to go through and what the Palestinians are going through at this particular moment. The black South Africans, especially the mine workers, such as myself, who bore the brunt of South African racial segregation and capitalism, and understood the purposes of mechanisms of apartheid, know that when we talk about the conditions faced by the Palestinians, comrades, we are talking about the apartheid system that was visited upon us. When we see the controls of movements on the residents of Palestinians, it reminds us of the Group Areas Act and the Pakistan system. When we see the elaborate Israeli attempts to humiliate the Palestinians, it reminds us of the daily humiliation and assault on our own dignity by the apartheid system every day and every day of their lives. That's why we know that the South African working class will never really be free until the Palestinian working class has been liberated as well.
Secretary General, thank you very much indeed. A couple of quick questions for you, quick answers. Thanks so much. Yeah, thank you.
I would like you to tell us who was finally responsible for the end of apartheid.
The people, the people of South Africa, working in a close coordination with the freedom-loving people of the world, were responsible for the destruction of apartheid at the end.
Comrade Vavi, thank you very much. Since you're not sure of which day your birthday is, I now realize why he expects me to be nice to him every day of the year. Thank you very much indeed.